Welcome, everyone, to the NACDA Data on Aging podcast. I'm Catherine Lavender, the project manager for NACDA.
And I'm Dr. Sayan Kim, Director of NACDA here at the University of Michigan.
Thanks for tuning in. Learn more about NACDA and ICPSR by visiting nacda-aging.org or find us on social media. Welcome, everyone, to the NACDA Data on Aging podcast series. Today, we're talking with Dr. Carrie A Karvonen-Gutierrez, and she is the PI of the Study of Women's Health Across the Nations series. Dr. Karvonen-Gutierrez is an epidemiologist focusing on the impact of reproductive aging, chronological aging, and obesity on age-related health outcomes, including physical functioning, frailty, osteoarthritis, disability, and cardiometabolic dysfunction. She is the Associate Professor of Epidemiology and Associate Chair for Faculty Affairs in Epidemiology, the Director for the Center Lifecourse Epidemiology and Aging Research at the University of Michigan, and she and her team seek to understand the impact of critical life stages and transitions on metabolic and musculoskeletal health outcomes. So we're going to get started here on our questions in a minute, but I just want to say one more time, our guest today is the principal investigator of multiple NIH-funded studies of women, including SWAN, the Michigan site, and the Michigan Bone Health and Metabolism Study. So we're really looking forward to talking with her about these longitudinal studies of health and, just diving into more of these studies. And so I guess I'll go ahead and ask the first question. Uh,
Sure.
Can you talk about your research a little bit as a PI of SWAN? Your research explores the intersection of menopause, aging, and chronic disease risk. What findings from your studies using the longitudinal SWAN dataset help to shape current scientific understanding of women's health during midlife and beyond? And let's get started.
Hey, thank you. That was a lovely introduction. And I just do want to clarify, I'm one of the many PIs of SWAN. I'm the PI of the Michigan site of SWAN. But SWAN is a multi-site study. It includes 7 clinical sites across the United States, as well as a coordinating center and a laboratory. And so there's actually 9 PIs of SWAN, which is a great, wonderful group of people to work with, and really, I think, adds to the wonderful integrated nature of SWAN. And we can talk more about that in a little bit. But as you mentioned, my work broadly is interested in aging and women's health. I came into the field really interested in women's health broadly. And in fact, I came to Michigan many, many years ago for my master's in public health, because at the time, Michigan was the only program that had a women's health focus or program that was not uniquely focused on maternal and child health. And so I knew I wanted to pursue women's health. Certainly reproductive health and maternal and child health were of interest, but I really was interested much more broadly in women's health beyond the process of reproduction and caregiving. And so Michigan has long had a great history of focusing broadly on women's health across many different aspects and facets. And because of my work on SWAN, as well as the Michigan Bone Health and Metabolism Study, which in some ways was the predecessor of SWAN, has really helped hone my interests in understanding the midlife phase, which is the life phase that we say is between roughly about age 40 to 65 or so. And not only understanding that life phase because it's an important period of time socially and economically and health-wise, but also for females, really unique because of the experience of menopause that happens during that time. Yeah. And so became very interested in menopause as a physiologic event that is really impactful on a variety of different health systems and sets the stage for the aging process broadly, and particularly sets up changes in chronic disease risk during the midlife and then beyond. And so broadly, I consider myself a women's health epidemiologist and a chronic disease epidemiologist. But as you suggested, or as you alluded to, my area of research that I lead in SWAN is regarding physical functioning, frailty, falls, and osteoarthritis. And so I'll speak to some of my work in those areas that I think are some of the most surprising findings. So my work in SWAN started when I did my dissertation on osteoarthritis in SWAN. And so osteoarthritis is what we think of kind of colloquially as the wear and tear arthritis. It's the one that is very common as you age. It's painful in your joints. And we've always known that body size was a major risk factor for osteoarthritis. And the thought was really always that makes sense because it's increased mechanical loading across the joints, particularly the knees and the hips. And so therefore you have a higher body weight, you have higher force. That's what's breaking those joints down. And as I was coming into my dissertation program, there was a really famous paper written that was called "Obese People Do Not Walk on Their Hands." And I just remember being so struck by that paper. And the premise of it was that we see these very strong associations of higher body size and osteoarthritis of the hands as well as the shoulder. And clearly those are not weight-bearing joints. Clearly we don't walk on our hands. And so the idea that there was a causal mechanism that was purely through this increased mechanical force was called into question. And so using data from SWAN, because at the Michigan site, at least, we had longitudinal data, not only of a variety of measures like body size, fat mass, as well as biomarkers of different cardiovascular and metabolic risk factors. But we also had longitudinal x-rays over time of the knee joints. And so we could characterize the timing of when someone developed osteoarthritis and how severe that osteoarthritis was. And so using data both from SWAN, but also from NHANES, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey and is a nationally representative survey of the entire United States sample of the United States population. I did a series of different analyses where what ultimately I showed is that there's, in addition to the impact of excessive force across the joints that does have a relationship with joint damage, the biomarkers or the metabolic products that are either secreted by or correlated with the amount of body mass or body fat that one has is also independently related to damage of the joint tissue. And one of the novel ones that was included in my dissertation was a biomarker called leptin. And so leptin is what we call an adipokine. It's secreted by the fat tissue itself. And leptin itself, that molecule is highly pro-inflammatory. And we see that in vitro, leptin can destroy soft tissue, it can destroy the collagen and so forth. And so using observational study data, really showing that impact of that excessive fat producing high levels of leptin, extremely high levels of leptin, was associated with osteoarthritis risk over and above the risk posed by excessive body weight. And so that was my first foray into longitudinal data. I think it was really a fun, eye-opening experience for me because it allowed me to see the power of longitudinal data and being able to assess risk. And what we saw, kind of the principal finding of all of that work was that there were kind of three groups of individuals moving through time with respect to their osteoarthritis risk. There were people who never had osteoarthritis over a period of 10 years. There were people who started without osteoarthritis and developed it over the 10 years. And then there were people who already at the very start of SWAN, when they were in their mid 40s to early 50s, already had osteoarthritis. And when we looked at the leptin levels of those individuals, they were completely non-overlapping, whereby those people who never developed osteoarthritis had low and consistently low levels of leptin. The middle group that developed osteoarthritis over time had a little bit higher leptin levels, but that those that already had it at the start had levels of leptin that were far in excess of either of the other groups. And so being able to see that in longitudinal data was really, really very cool. And then I'll speak a little bit about some of the physical functioning work we've done in SWAN. And so we know that osteoarthritis is one of the leading causes of disability and physical functioning impairment. And so that's kind of how then I landed into working on physical functioning. I'm really interested in that as an outcome of osteoarthritis. And so SWAN has measured physical functioning since baseline using self-reported questionnaires of physical functioning. It's a survey called the SF-36. And then at the Michigan site, we've also had regular data collection of objective measures of physical functioning. So how quick do you walk? How quickly can you climb stairs? What's your grip strength? Those sorts of things. And a lot of other studies of younger or midlife adults haven't measured physical functioning, I think because the premise is that we're still in good health and everything is fine and nothing to see here. But looking at data from SWAN, I think one of the most straightforward but important findings that we published was that the midlife is actually a really important time, especially for women, for changes in physical function. We see that between that life stage of 40 and 55, so kind of early midlife, about 20% of women report some type of limitations in physical functioning, and that as we expect, those limitations increase with age. What we see differently during the midlife as opposed to late adulthood is that the pattern of physical functioning limitations is really quite dynamic. And in fact, when we look again longitudinally over time, this is the value of the longitudinal data, we see that over that midlife phase, people are as likely to decline in their physical functioning as they are to improve. And so unlike in late adulthood, where there's kind of a slow, gradual decline, midlife is very dynamic. We see these trajectories where people have a dive and then they come back up and they improve and then they might go back down. And what this really suggests to us, and I think suggests to the field, is that midlife is a really important life stage to think about improving health because it is dynamic. It is malleable. There's something that is driving those improvements over time in physical functioning. And so trying to identify who those individuals are that are improving, what mitigates their perpetual decline and allows for that improvement are things that we might then capitalize on as we go to develop interventions. And so that the midlife is not just this kind of silent phase of life with good health, but in fact, it's a really important phase where these changes commence. And yet it's a highly malleable phase where we might be able to intervene. And then finally, I think the other major finding coming out of SWAN with respect to physical functioning is how important the menopause itself is related to physical functioning. I think sometimes, especially among older adults, we understand physical functioning as an age-related process. But when we look at the menopause, we see that it's not just about chronologic age. It's not just about how old you are, but really where you are in that process of the menopausal transition. We characterize menopause time, either time before or time after a female's final menstrual period. And so we are able to capture that date only because of the longitudinal data. So we every year ask people if they've had menses in the last 12 months. And if they have, then we keep that date, their last menses, on file, and then we ask them again next year. And so once we get to the point where they say, no, I haven't had menses in the last 12 months, then we can go back and identify what that date was of their last menses. And so when we look at our data by menopause time and not chronologic age, we see that there are important inflection points with respect to the menopause, as well as the hormones that change during the menopause that are associated with physical functioning. And so there's something about the menopause itself, whether it's changes in body composition, whether it's changes in physical fitness or whatever else, that are actually related to changes in physical functioning over and above, again, those changes in aging. And so that this story of midlife health is not just one of kind of predictable aging that we are starting to think of earlier, but really looking at the importance of these physiologic changes that are happening during the menopause.
For sure.
I'll stop there. I talked a lot.
No, that's totally fine. I mean, I feel like what you really so eloquently pointed out is that a lot of these aging processes are processes and
Yeah.
not, and a lot of survey questions ask, are you retired or did you experience menopause or did you experience osteoporosis? But all of these concepts are very gradual processes that happen over a very long period of time. So these are not statuses, right? So I feel like it's such a good example of longitudinal data use. So that leads to the next question for the data
Mm-hmm.
users.
Yeah.
SWAN is, as one of the 9 PIs of SWAN, SWAN is one of the longest running studies of women's health and aging. So can you tell me a little bit more about this data set and how researchers can use it? Do you have any advice for the researchers interested in using SWAN?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, as it is one of the longest studies of women's health and aging, we're entering our 30th year of the longitudinal studies. So the
Wow,
longitudinal phase started in 1996.
it's a
Um,
legacy.
it's crazy. It's like a national treasure, I feel. I'm so
Mm.
honored to work on it. The study actually started a little bit before that in 1994. In 1994, there was a cross-sectional survey done of about 16,000 women across the 7 clinical sites. And that survey was done really to identify or to create a sampling frame so that a longitudinal cohort could be enrolled. Because the inclusion criteria for SWAN were um, quite specific because it was a study of the menopausal transition. And so we had to recruit women that were eligible to achieve the study outcome, which is going through the menopause.
Mm.
And so, because of that, women were excluded from the study if they were no longer having menses in the past 3 months, if they were currently pregnant or lactating, if they were using hormone therapy because that would mask our ability to observe menses. They were excluded if they didn't have a uterus or they were or if they'd had both ovaries removed. Um, and then the study was looking for women between the ages of 42 to 52, knowing that the kind of average age of menopause is about 51, between 51 and 52. So getting a group of women that we could observe going through the transition in a reasonable point of time. So there was this cross-sectional study of 16,000 women that served as a sampling frame. And from there, a sample of 3,300, actually 3,302 women was drawn from that sampling frame representing sites across the United States. And that made up then the longitudinal cohort that has been followed forward in time. Now we've completed, our last visit was study visit 17. And so we have 30 years of data over 17
Wow.
follow-up visits, roughly annually. There's a couple gaps in there. So the original sample of those 3,302 women were at the 7 clinical sites across the US. That includes Michigan. And so our sample at Michigan is drawn from the communities of Ypsilanti and Inkster, Michigan, which is just a bit east of Ann Arbor. We have a site in Chicago. We have a site in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Boston, Massachusetts, Newark, New Jersey, and then 2 sites in California. So Oakland, California, in collaboration with Kaiser Permanente, and then a site at UCLA in Los Angeles, California. And you might ask the question, well, why aren't there any Southern representation? Why
Mm.
isn't there any middle of the country representation? And so SWAN was designed to be representative of the diversity of types of women that are in the United States, but not to be representative of the population of the United States. And
For
so
sure.
the sites were selected through a competitive process by the National Institutes of Health, and the 7 best applications that rose to the top were put together and working together then as a single study. And so those 3302 women by design represent women that are racially or ethnically non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black, Hispanic, Chinese, or Japanese. And so by the recruitment paradigm of that study, each site recruited a white sample and then a site-specific non-white sample. And so 4 of the sites, including Michigan, Chicago, Boston, and Pittsburgh, recruited white and Black women. The Newark site recruited white and Hispanic women. The Los Angeles site recruited white and white and Japanese women. And then the Oakland site recruited white and Chinese women. And so, as I said, this study's been running now for 17 follow-up visits. It includes a deep phenotyping of health characteristics, health behaviors, demographics, and so forth. And so there's a multiple different ways researchers can utilize the data set. One way is to use the publicly available data. So visits 1 through 10, the data from SWAN has been deposited at ICPSR here at the University of Michigan. And you can go onto that website. It's free and it's publicly available, and it's relatively straightforward to create an account and be able to download that data. And there's been such great work done to characterize the code books and archive all of that. And so that's all there, and that goes through visit 10, as I said. The other way to access it would be if you are not working with a SWAN investigator. The National Institute of Aging has an aging research biobank that they manage, and includes all of the SWAN data all the way through visit 16. We're about to deposit visit 17. So they include both the data, but also SWAN has a very rich biorepository of our samples of serum, plasma, and urine. And the NIA biorepository also archives those, and those samples can be requested through working with the NIA Aging Research Biobank as well. And so that process, it's an online process. You put in a proposal, you say what variables you're interested in, you say what types of biospecimens you might need, and then you work with the NIA to do that. And then, of course, kind of the last way to work with SWAN data is to partner with one of the many, many SWAN investigators. There's investigators not only at our 9 locations now where there are PIs, but truly across the country.
For sure.
We have so many people that have grown up and grown up academically in SWAN and are continuing to work on that data. And so working with and partnering with one of the SWAN investigators that do have access to the data is another way to go about that.
It's truly special to think about how middle-aged women grow older in SWAN, and then younger academics grow up using SWAN, and because it's 30 years. 30 years is someone's life course.
Yeah, and to demonstrate that point, every single one of the SWAN sites right now is on at least their 2nd generation of SWAN PIs.
Wow.
Here at Michigan, I'm the 3rd SWAN PI here at Michigan. I started working on SWAN when I was 24 years old, and kept thinking of these midlife people as so far away. And I was studying people like my mom. And when I had my 40th birthday, it was like this reality check of what midlife is, and this life phase that I've been studying for decades, I'm now a part of. And certainly we have grown up in SWAN, so many of us, and it's been really fun. One of my doctoral students was defending her dissertation last week, and she was thanking the original PI of SWAN, Mary Fran Sowers, who is since deceased, but she called Mary Fran her grand advisor, because Mary Fran was my mentor, and then I mentored this doctoral student, Jillian Baker. And so it's really special to see the generations of academic work and training that have have come out of SWAN.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Thank you so much. I've gone to conferences and we have researchers come to the booth, and even today, somebody will come by and ask about research on menopause, and SWAN will be new to them, and I'm always delighted to refer them to it. And kind of surprised because when I first started working at ICBSR, SWAN was one of the first data series that I recognized that was cited out sort of in the wild, like in women's magazines and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And or on the news. I've seen it cited like in news reports. And so it's um, just so great to hear more about some of these details. And you kind of started to get into some of the sampling, which I feel is a natural segue to our next question. Um, just about how longitudinal data can pose unique challenges for researchers, such as attrition and, complex sampling techniques.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about how you and your team address these hurdles and what best practices you'd recommend to aging researchers working with SWAN and maybe even specifically with NACDA's holdings of SWAN?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good question. And, longitudinal data is kind of a different beast. And there's so many things to think about, not only statistically and what are, the best ways to handle that data and to think about what's missing and so forth, but also just to change your frame of the types of questions you can ask. You can ask much more um, nuanced questions and really start to understand
Sure.
processes, as
Sure.
you alluded to earlier. So there's a couple things to consider when working with SWAN data. So one of them is that it was recruited from 7 clinical sites across the US. It's not a nationally representative sample, and at not all of the sites are even representative as a population-based sample. So different sites took on their recruitment in different ways. If you're interested, there's a textbook chapter written way back in 96 or 97 about the sampling techniques that went into each site, and I'd be happy to share that with the listeners. At Michigan, we did a population-based sample. We got a listing of electrical utility listings of the communities where we were recruiting in. They went door to door, asking if there
Wow.
was anyone eligible for the cross-sectional study, and then interviewing those people to see if they were eligible for the longitudinal study. So that was a tremendous amount of work. Of course, some of the other sites, including Oakland, California, which has collaboration with Kaiser, was able to leverage the medical record information to help identify participants because it was seated within that health system. Some sites with some of the populations that were harder to reach, such as our Japanese sample at Los Angeles, relied on, among other things, but on referrals and a bit of snowball sampling just to make sure that they could get enough people to represent that group. And so I think you need to go into SWAN, working with SWAN, knowing that there's all these nuances that come into the data set. And so just being really cognizant of that. Not only that, but then I think there are some important selection biases that have developed in SWAN, both
Sure.
on the side of left truncation, but also on right
Mm.
truncation, that I think we are now really starting to appreciate and have, frankly, the statistical methodologies to be able to evaluate and handle them. We had a wonderful doctoral student at Michigan a few years ago, Alexis Reeves, who did her dissertation on quantifying the amount of left censoring and right censoring that has happened within SWAN, and then to see what the impact on that has been. We know, for example, that on the left-hand side or on the baseline side, because of all the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the study, that certain racial and ethnic groups were more or less likely to be eligible to get into SWAN. So, for example, we see that our Black women and our Hispanic women had a lower likelihood of being eligible for the longitudinal cohort because of the need to have both ovaries and uterus.
Oh,
And
wow.
there's been a lot of gynecologic surgery in certain demographic groups for a lot of different reasons. And so she was able to show that. We know that on the attrition side that people are missing for a variety of different reasons, some of which is for reasons that will induce selection bias. And so really needing to understand those. And so through the work that Alexis did, and then many of us have done other iterations of since then, we've used an inverse probability weighting approach to be able to identify those individuals that are representing a group of people like them that either weren't included in the study because of their ineligibility or didn't remain in the study because, again, of different reasons related to their participation. And so by creating those inverse probability weights, we can then upweight individuals in the data set to make the data set better represent the group of individuals that were intended to be included in that study. And so by doing so, we see that it has a really important impact on our estimation of time to events, specifically for our Black participants and our Hispanic participants. And so we've been very interested on the timing of age at menopause or the timing of onset of diabetes or things like that. And by using those inverse probability weights, we can get unbiased measures of that timing. And when we do that, we actually see that for those participants, the timing of those events is actually much earlier than we would have estimated if we didn't account for that selection bias. So I think using approaches like that are really, really important. And that was done using not only the cross-sectional data, but also then the longitudinal data source and looking at who from the cross-sectional study wasn't eligible to get into the longitudinal data set. The other thing I always tell my trainees is that on the attrition side, we see that missingness really means something, especially when we have outcomes like physical functioning. And so we might have all of our other data on participants, but we don't actually have a gait speed or we don't actually have a grip strength because we're only able to get a telephone call with them or a mailed interview, because they are too functionally limited to actually come in and get into our facility to do those objective-based tests. And so rather than just excluding them from the analysis and saying that they had missing data, instead looking at why those individuals have that missing data and then making a decision about how to keep them in the analysis. We could do an IPW or inverse probability weighting approach, but sometimes if we have information about the participant and why they're not coming in for their visit, we can actually then do a really good job estimating what their functioning would have been. Maybe we assign them to the lowest tertile or something like that in an analysis. And so we've done a lot of that as well. And over time, kind of realizing how important that is, we also now collect information about why participants didn't complete an entire protocol. So if we know that they are in a nursing home, if we know that they have undergone a major surgery or something like that, we actually collect that data now and are working on coding that so that that can be better incorporated into our analyses as well.
That sounds like such a big undertaking, but also such rich data on missingness. And I always also tell my trainees that missingness happens for a reason.
Yeah.
And there's a differential patterns of missing. And Carrie, you and I are in the same boat because selection has been such a big piece for my research. And so I also use inverse probability treatment weighting and entropy balancing, energy balancing to adjust for selection into like retirement, for example, or social relationships, because there's differential selection of retirement. And then when you talked about hormone replacement therapy and then women undergoing different surgeries, I thought about my mom because of her double ovarectomy, and she wouldn't have been eligible for the study. So I feel like that leads to our next question, final question. So looking ahead, how do you see, or what do you see as the most sort of urgent unanswered questions in women's aging research? And then how can the scientific and data sharing community like NACDA support progress on this front?
Well, these are such good questions, and I might answer this kind of two different ways. One, I think, is what are some of the most urgent questions that can be answered with data that's currently available? And then I think we have some urgent questions that, frankly, are just going to require brand new data collection.
I
There's
love
so
that.
many questions we didn't know to ask or plan
Yes.
for in a study like SWAN. And the world is different today than it was 30 years ago, right? So I think some of the most urgent questions that can be answered currently by SWAN data is really to understand why some women go through the midlife and the menopausal transition and have all of these acute stressors and whatnot, yet remain highly functional, highly healthy, and highly engaged, and why some do not.
Yeah.
That is a big $1 million question, and that could be with physical function, it could be with social function, it could be with cognitive function. And really, what are the relationships between those things, as well as then other health-related outcomes? Is it because someone had a stroke and didn't get rehab? Is it because someone had a major fracture and the joint never healed? And so trying to identify those factors of resilience, but also those risk factors that are really going to need to be important as we care for these individuals across their life course. I think, too, with SWAN data in concert with some other data sets that include men, really understanding the female-centric aging processes. We know that females age very different than do males. They tend to live longer, but they tend to live longer with substantially increased levels of disability. And why is that? Is that because they're undertaking greater caregiving activities across their life course? Is it still lingering changes from the menopausal transition? Is it because they're not getting the care they need, or their symptoms aren't being understood? I think there's just so many questions there. So I think both the resilience piece and the sex differences piece is really important. I think for midlife women and some of the questions that SWAN cannot answer because we don't have either the contemporaneous current worldview data of midlife women, or we just didn't have that as part of our original questions, is really understanding the role of hormone therapy with aging. Certainly, we know that in SWAN's not a great data set to answer those questions because first, it was an exclusion criteria at the start. Women certainly were able to subsequently use hormone therapy, but SWAN was recruited and followed in a post-WHI world. And so rates of hormone therapy were very low given the concerns that came out of the Women's Health Initiative. And the formulations of what is in hormone therapy now are very different than they were 30 years ago. And so particularly with changes like the removal of the black box warning on hormone therapy and some of the emerging data suggesting how important or beneficial rather hormone therapy can be in certain timeframes for certain people, for certain things, really understanding that I think is an important piece to understand the midlife aging process and what might be able to mitigate some of those changes. And then I think finally the environment. We have some inklings from SWAN that the burden of exposure to phthalates and phenols and so forth, heavy metals, has been really strongly associated with these major health outcomes. It's associated with timing of age at menopause. It's associated with timing of diabetes and changes in body composition and so forth. And we know that some of those exposures come through food packaging or personal care products and so forth. But that data that we have in SWAN about those levels and those exposures was collected now almost 30 years ago. And so the distribution and the prevalence of those chemicals in our world are different now than they were 30 years ago. And so I think we really need to understand those impacts on aging in a more contemporary context, and identify how quickly changes in the usage patterns can come with changes in health, and whether or not those can be overcome by using clean products and so forth. It's something that's always on my mind. I have a daughter who's 12, and we spend a lot of time at Sephora or Ulta, and, looking at kind of all those products. And I can't help but wonder, like, in today's world, where there's such a surge in the types of personal care products and the variety of personal care products that people are using, what that might have on their long-term health, particularly for females, given that we know many of those chemicals are endocrine disruptors and so forth. So I think that that's a really pressing question that needs to be asked about women's health and aging.
Yeah, those are amazing questions. And as as you study more about women's health, we like academics, we know that there are more answers and then even more questions
Of
to be
course.
answered.
Yeah,
These are very important questions, like the role of hormone replacement therapy, and then like about the personal care products. We also know that women tend to use more personal care products, and if people engage in like 8-step skincare routine, and that's hundreds of chemicals that you put on your body. So
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And given kind of the diversity of where a lot of these products are coming, they're coming in from all over the world now.
Sure.
And I
With
think
different
it's
guidelines.
really different guidelines, different packaging and so forth. So I think there's a lot there. I think it could be, someone else's life's work to be able to sort all that out.
Yeah, I think you just gave us, I don't know, 150 NIH grant
Yeah, right.
proposals.
That always seems to be the case.
Definitely a great idea for the next generation of researchers to dive into thinking about, personal care products or other products that women use. I mean, it's not that long ago that we learned that there was lead found in sanitary products. That wasn't 20 or 30 years ago. That was like within the last 5 years. And it's scary to think about it, but hopefully we can learn a lot from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us today and
You're
for
welcome.
all of this rich information about SWAN and just about your career. And, we're honored to have up through Visit 10 at NACDA. And we will definitely link to the data series in the description of this podcast and provide the link to the document that you mentioned. Is there anything else you wanted to say, about longitudinal research or SWAN before we go?
Just, I think that don't be afraid of it. I mean, longitudinal data can be daunting, but I think with the way in which our statistical software programs have evolved, it's become so much easier, even from when I started my dissertation. I mean, you can do a longitudinal model now with a line of code in R or SAS or whatever your favorite is, and you can ask such rich, different questions, and really questions that can get us further along. I teach our intro epi course in the School of Public Health. And so, we spend a lot of time talking about the difference between cross-sectional data and longitudinal data, and how you have to have longitudinal data to understand risk, and how powerful a question of risk can be in a causal framework. And so, I think it's really important to not be afraid of those types of analyses, because it's such a powerful thing to be able to say that you are linking with incident data and longitudinal data, and being able to observe these processes, as you mentioned, not just the presence of something. So and there's a ton of data in SWAN. Multiple people could work the rest of their life publishing in just SWAN, and we wouldn't even scratch the surface. So I do hope people are interested in it. And then I'll also share the link to the NIA Aging Research Biobank, because that's a great resource if you want to get more in-depth data than is available at ICPSR, or if you want to access the biospecimens that are available.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm-
And
Oh,
sorry.
sorry. I'm personally excited to dive more into SWAN data sets. I'm very curious about what kind of questions we can address.
Yeah, that's great. And particularly anybody at Michigan that is interested in using SWAN data, feel free to reach out to me and see what we can do to help support that work. We have a newly renamed center. We used to be called the Center for Midlife Science, but as SWAN women have continued to age, they're no longer midlife. Our mean age now is 75. And we have a couple other studies under our umbrella. And so we've renamed ourselves the Center for Lifecourse Epidemiology and Aging Research. And in there we have, laboratorians and data analysts and epidemiologists who have really, strong expertise working with SWAN data. And so don't spin your wheels by yourself. If there's something that we can help with, we're more than happy to do that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
My director and I keep having, the great minds think alike situation.
The jinx.
Yes. But Carrie, you proactively answered the question that I was going to put out there, which was, about people reaching out to collaborate. So thank you so much for doing that. And
sure.
Thanks again for joining us and talking with us today. And we really look forward to seeing, more from SWAN in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you
have
so
a great
much.
afternoon.
You too.
You too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much to our guest and to our listeners for joining us on this podcast. You can find links to studies we referenced by viewing the description and content below. If you have questions or ideas, please email us at icpsr-nacda@umich.edu.